Hello, everyone. We will be starting shortly. We'll just wait for a minute or so for more people to join and we'll start. All right, so we can get started. Welcome to Friday Night AI. We are very pleased to have you join us tonight. My name is Rada Mihalcha. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Michigan. I'm also the director of the AI lab. And about 2 years ago, we started the Friday Night AI series in an attempt to engage more closely with the community, with all of you, on topics of interest to everyone. I'm very pleased to have you all join tonight for a discussion on a very timely topic, the role that AI can play in relation to racial disparities in legal enforcement. We are a year into America's racial reckoning and 7 years into the Black Lives Matter movement. And the national conversation has brought renewed attention to the relationship between legal enforcement and the communities they serve. At the same time, another conversation is taking place. Can AI be used to expose and combat racial disparities in the justice system, or will it simply reinforce existing biases? Tonight, we will be discussing the uses and misuses of AI in policy and highlight areas where big data can be a tool to combat inequality in the criminal justice system. The conversation will speak to the challenges at the intersection of technology, equity, and racial justice. Before we get started, just a few logistics. I will be moderating the discussion. We have here our amazing panelists, Professor Kemp and Professor Jargens. For the first 30 minutes, the panelists will talk about various aspects of the use of AI for legal enforcement, and specifically the role that AI can play with respect to racial disparities. Then for the second half, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. And we ask that you please do that using the Q&A functionality at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You should see a Q&A sign, and you can use that to ask your questions. You cannot do that using the chat. The chat is disabled for today's webinar. So with that, we can get started. Tonight, Friday Night AI is a collaboration between Michigan AI, the School of Information, the Department of Organizational Studies, and jointly with the Ann Arbor Public Library, which is broadcasting the event live on YouTube as we speak. I would like to start first by introducing the panelists. I have here Professor Nicholas Kamp, who is an assistant professor of organizational studies at the University of Michigan, where he studies the social psychology of racial inequality. His main program of research examines the role routine police-citizen encounters play in undermining police community trust, and how these disparities can be addressed, combining analysis of officer-worn body camera footage and community surveys. Professor David Jargens is in the School of Information, where he's an assistant professor, and his research work focusing on developing language processing methods to understand the social dimensions of language, particularly those around issues of respect, intimacy, and empathy. So thank you for joining us tonight. And my first question, just to help the audience to get to know you better, I would like to ask, what was your career path how did you get interested in AI and what excites you about this field? I will start with you, Nick, if you want to talk about your career path.
Sure. So I'm trained as a social psychologist, studying stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. So a lot of what we do as psychologists are experiments in the lab or online. And I really became interested in AI when we went outside the lab to look at disparities in police community encounters and body camera footage. And for me, AI was a tool that let us scale what people heard and read in these body camera encounters and scale that to large amounts of body camera footage so we could look at trends and how officers communicate across race.
Thank you. And David, if you don't mind sharing about your career and how you got interested in AI, what excites you?
Sure. I'll say originally I was a philosophy major in college. So if any folks have philosophy major kids out there, not to worry, your kids can still be ADI professors eventually. But I think that really led me to questions of like the theory of mind. And I was like, well, artificial intelligence might be a fun way to study that. So I started picking up classes in computer science. And then eventually I realized that language to me was like one of the core ways we could think about people, which led to, I guess, a lifetime and a career of thinking about how to study language with computers to get them to speak it or understand it or reason about it. And that's sort of been where I've found my joy in AI.
I would agree with that passion. I share it, the passion about language. But of course, AI would encompass many other very interesting angles around how we express intelligence. And tonight, the discussion, you're both doing a lot of interesting work on different projects, but we really want to keep focus around legal enforcement. And so one question, even before we go into the role that AI can play, is what are some challenges in working with police or police-related data? David, if you wanted to start, or whoever wants to take it first.
Sure. So I think one of the challenges to working with police and police-related data is notions of respect for the community. I think often from AI standpoint, it's like we have data and we want to understand what that is. And I think the challenge is thinking it's not just this is data, but these are people and these are real people's interactions, and making sure that we have notions of privacy and sort of just respect for the person when we deal with this data has created not a challenge in the sense of like it's difficult, but sort of something that has to be taken into account at every step of the process. I think also from working with police, thinking of AI as a partner, but not necessarily like a neutral partner in that discussion, and making sure that that conversation isn't one of punitive, like let's use AI to find you doing bad things, or one of let's use AI to like help and maybe result in bad things elsewhere. So thinking about it as trying to have those conversations I think that those conversations are often very challenging due to predisposed notions of what AI should be doing in this space.
Yeah, so I want to echo the first thing that David said, just about a large part of the challenges is just being thoughtful and considerate with how we define our research questions and how we think about data. When we're talking about body camera recordings, these are some of the like low points in many people's lives, and people did not choose to get pulled over by the police. So I think that means that for every question we ask, we need to be really considerate of what that question means. Just in terms of practical challenges, it can be everything from how departments maintain their data or don't. They don't keep their body camera recordings. They keep it as evidence, not as data. And also, even just on the ground, are police officers turning on their cameras? What's the department policy, and what do the departments do to enforce that policy? So it's a policy question before you even get to the research question that I think is really important.
And is that so? I'm maybe naive in asking this question. Is the kind of data, is it up to a police department to share it? Is it considered to be in the public domain? Because so how would you even get access to such data in the first place?
Yeah, and so I think that speaks to an even larger challenge in this country, in that so much of policing is highly localized, and there are very few cases in which you have uniform collection and sharing of data. So there's only a handful of states that require their police departments to report traffic stop data and make it publicly available in a way where you can compare different departments. In the absence of those laws and policies, it's up to each department how they collect their data, and in many cases how they share it. So I think one of the biggest challenges to using data to think about race and policing is just how the data is kept or not kept, and what gets recorded and what gets shared.
So one good example that Sharad Goyal, who's I believe now at Harvard, has started the Open Policing Project, where they think through either easy access from certain states or collections through Freedom of Information Act requests, have collected this traffic stop data. And you can see on their website that there's a giant field or table of like what's available from which jurisdiction. And it's so varied, as Nick said, due to like local jurisdictions and what they're willing to share and what they collect. Even certain states don't collect everything or don't track certain things, which makes it kind of a mixture of what you actually get when you finally get to peek at what's there.
And I could see on top of that even a mixture of what kind of equipment is being used for recordings and I don't know, body camera. I would just imagine that there is some heterogeneity there as well.
Police officers have a pretty complex job, and so data entry maybe falls to the lowest rung of things on their mind when they're entering stuff into the field. So the data is maybe not as clean as it could be, and mistakes happen.
So before we move on to talk about AI, in your work, you have been addressing racial disparities in legal enforcement. So can you share more about what kind of disparities we see in this space?
Yeah, so I would say we see racial disparities at every step of the criminal justice system. So that ranges from where police officers are deployed and what areas have a heavier police presence. We see disparities in the circumstances in which people are stopped. So white drivers tend to be stopped for more safety violations like running a stop sign or excessive speed, where African Americans are more likely to be stopped in circumstances like broken taillight or headlight. We see disparities in the interpersonal aspect of these encounters, so the respect that officers communicate to drivers they stop. And of course, in the cases of arrests and sentencing, there are pretty considerable disparities there too.
David, did you want to add anything?
I think Nick has captured many of the unfortunate disparities that we see.
So now let's see what is the AI angle on all these. Can you share with us how has AI been applied to reducing racial disparities? Whoever wants to start first.
I'll maybe say one of the ways in which we've seen AI deployed most in the situation, which nominally could be argued to reduce racial disparity, but is maybe the primary way in which it's deployed currently, is in predictive policing models. So there are many different startups and other firms who want to argue for objective ways to deploy police to minimize crime. Certainly that if you could deploy police in the most effective way, maybe this would reduce the overall risk to the community. But some of these systems can be trained on past data, which may reinforce systemic biases. And I think that they can be quite risky, but I feel like that's where I've seen most of the AI applied, at least commercially, at a broad scale. I think, maybe Nick can speak to more of the academic side of things, but I think there's also a flip side to that of thinking about like Nick said, that much of the data that's collected is not necessarily evidence, but could be used to actually track these better and reduce disparities as a result.
Yeah, so to kind of echo what David said, a lot of the debate around predictive models of policing is whether they increase or decrease the footprint of police officers in communities of color. I think, unfortunately, we can talk about this later, many times it exacerbates existing inequities. But in cases where officers are engaging in practices like stop and frisk, where the vast majority of frisks don't, in New York, didn't uncover any contraband at all. It was an intrusive and wasteful practice. Sharad Goel and others have tried to find ways to create criteria to restrain officers' discretion in those kinds of circumstances and to reduce the footprint of those kinds of searches. I'd say, as a psychologist and someone interested in officer community interactions, one of the goals of our research is to figure out how we can capture elements of police-citizen interactions through language, and then possibly use that to evaluate trainings that are supposed to improve those interactions, as well as, you can imagine further down the road, flagging encounters that may have been particularly caustic to police community relations, so that departments can review those.
And what is the benefit? Why you mentioned, David, there are several startups in the space. What is the benefit of AI? Why would we need AI to tell us about racial disparities when we could maybe just listen to the people who experience it?
Yeah, so I think Rebecca Haiti and Jennifer Aber had this great paper where they argued that I think there's like 3 pieces to that. So I think one is to offer context to the way in which some of these disparities show up, so you can actually put them within the larger social data context and control for different factors. I think there's, like Nick was talking about, in terms of the predictive policing, there's often associations of certain neighborhoods with crime that you can make claims for, but really you can sort of challenge these associations between people or races or locations using more, rigorous statistical measures, which are harder to object to. And I think then also highlighting, people in institutions, perhaps more institutional level, where there is disparity, and trying to make a difference in that regard. I think, but I do think that there's a huge risk for sort of this AI algorithmic solutionism that comes into play of like, well, if only we deployed this, we would fix it. And I don't think that should ever be the goal. It's more of a supportive technology to maybe help quantify these voices that come from the community, which I don't think you could do this work without that community support.
Yeah, so I certainly agree that there's no way that AI can replace the experiences of communities and the experience that people have with law enforcement. I think it can help supplement those. I mean, that's kind of what we did with when we asked people to view police-citizen interactions and report how the officer was interacting with community members. We just like scaled that up from those judgments to a larger amount of data. So I think what AI can do is help like scale up like a lot of these concerns and see how prevalent they are. And once you're able to capture some of those behaviors as they occur in interactions, I think it makes it easier to intervene on them, and also to tell whether your efforts at changing those behaviors are successful or not.
Just follow up to that, what will be necessary for that to hold? So we are talking about the usefulness of AI, because then we can do it at scale and actually listen to even more voices than if we were to listen individually. But what would that entail? Maybe in connection to a previous question on actually having access to the data, and what are some of the challenges for actually deploying AI? Assume there will be this perfect AI that will not have downsides. We'll talk about that in a bit. But how would that happen?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's such a huge problem is just that asymmetries in this space, right? citizens will never have something like the Stingray camera that records every license plate that passes a police car. And so I think it's really important to take those power dynamics into account. I will say one path forward that I think is interesting and promising is in New York. We know a lot about CompStat, which was their data-driven policing program that had mixed results and possibly undermined community trust. But New York's also tried to advance this program called, I think it's like Community Stat, which is aimed at getting information from community members via like text surveys and other methods to try to get the temperature on the ground. So I think one of the questions we can, that I think is worth asking is what can we build, what can communities build to provide accountability for law enforcement.
So even for the predictive policing, I do think, sort of echoing Nick's point about New York City, Chicago had a interesting experiment where they were looking at two different types of programs, and one was doing more when they wanted to intervene, sending more police departments, but the other sort of predictive policing program, rather than send more police, was sending more community services to try to mitigate at that point. And I think that the same technology used for different end goals, or may actually, like, there may be opportunities there to revisit and say, what can the police or the community members do holistically with this to really mitigate the situation?
And you also brought up sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that you also brought up an important point, which is not only for racial disparities and legal enforcement and AI, but more broadly, wherever we build technology, I think it's essential to have close communication with the communities where that would be applied and used both ways, like from the beginning when one starts building the technology all the way to deployment. So you really touch upon that, on how it's important to have the communities front and center. So there is promise in the use of AI, and you mentioned some of it, but of course there are also downsides. So can you share some of the negative consequences of using AI for this specific space of racial disparities and legal enforcement?
So I think one thing, again, touching on Nick's part about the importance of the community, I think much of the data that we try to get is sort of backed by institutional practices, and where those practices have been unfair in different jurisdictions, building AI predictive models runs the risk of sort of reinforcing that. So for example, say you wanted to back out some objective criteria for whether you should be able to pull over this car. And we could say, let's build some AI system that an officer can use that in this certain circumstances, say this is a very fair decision to make. And we'll do that based on training on all the past ones. And in that jurisdiction, if that's a biased jurisdiction or there's high disparity, well, that AI system is just going to reinforce that. So I think that's a huge challenge in this space. I think another potential downside is sort of this gotcha, well, a risk of coming off as a gotcha for this technology. And I think that doesn't help either the police sort of accept this or the community sort of view this as a neutral technology that they can have a conversation with. So if it's like, oh, we're going to come and work with you, but we're only going to find the bad stuff, that doesn't seem to be a kind of opportunity that appears very risk-free for, I think, many folks.
Yeah, so just to kind of add to those points, I think a lot of the qualities that are attractive about AI, namely that it scales and there's an additional cost between doing something 10 times or like 100 times. I think that's one of the reasons that it can be a powerful tool for perpetuating inequality, and that a lot of what we expect from law enforcement is that there's going to be a certain amount of friction. Like, I don't think anyone would say that they want police officers enforcing all laws for all people all the time, or at least anyone who's driven over or under the speed limit before. But with some of these technologies, there's very little cost to police departments deploying them over a large number of people without their consent. So I see the fact that a lot of these technologies get deployed and then the public finds out after the fact, and becomes a question of accountability for past practices rather than a discussion about what limitations and what measures for accountability are in place before they're used in the field. So, on the other hand, those same qualities make AI a very powerful tool for exposing racial inequality, but it certainly means you have to be careful that the same tools aren't just reinforcing it with a veneer of objectivity because it's an algorithm doing it instead of a person.
I might also add, I think one of the other risks is say that we did deploy this, that there was some federal mandate that AI for measuring potential bias is deployed. And through massive interventions, all the departments sort of come out with no disparity. I think it's easy to say, oh, we're done, mission accomplished. We could put up banners or something. But I don't think that AI is really the right way to have that final say in the matter. And so I think one of the risks of deploying this is that it sort of hands off the responsibility for really evaluating the quality of our community policing to an AI as here's some objective measure, rather than listening to folks who are experiencing that. I think it can play a role, certainly as a metric, like Nick mentioned, that are training measures really effective at changing behavior. This is a great tool, I think, for doing that sort of thing. But for assessing whether we've actually fixed or solved something, I think the risk is that it becomes the ultimate answer of like, look, the number goes down, so we're done.
And that's a perfect segue to my next question. How do I go about evaluating these systems? As with any system, again, even outside this space, when we build a system, we want to have ways to figure out whether it works or not. So in this particular case, how would we evaluate the system? How do we know that it's actually accomplishing its mission?
I would say that some of the things that we should consider as citizens and ask our representatives and policymakers to consider is what checks are in place whenever AI is deployed to prevent it from just being deployed indiscriminately with no friction. And I think some of the cutting edge work in AI that's beyond my ken, but maybe David can speak to more concerns like transparency, right? A lot of machine learning employs techniques where it's hard to figure out what relationships are being used for prediction. And so I think it's important that we strive for transparency even when it hurts prediction. And I think that's something that we ought to ask both the practitioners and of the people developing these algorithms.
Yeah, I think a good example of this is that Detroit's, at least the Green Light program, which included video surveillance data. And so there's a large consideration of using AI for facial recognition and potentially trying to track people between high crime locales. And there was a large, I think, some discussion of this that like rose to the level of Congress of like, should we be able deploying this kind of AI technology for predictive policing of trying to recognize criminals as they walk down the street. And I think as a policymaker, we should really stop and consider what can go wrong in those. So maybe as an engineer, we might say that like, well, perfect is the enemy of the good enough. Or like we built the system, it's pretty good, but what happens when these AI systems make mistakes? And I don't think that there's going to be any AI system here that really is going to be perfect for you. Maybe even good enough, maybe good enough to be useful, hopefully. But the kinds of mistakes that we would need to make, or the system might make here, actually may have huge impacts on people's lives, being falsely accused, or just having a video surveillance log that maybe persists for long periods of time that goes unchecked and could be used for other kinds of investigations. So I do think engaging community folks that have a voice in whether they want this deployed in their community is critical, and also for the policymakers to think about when allowing this deployment of the technology, what's the downside of when something goes wrong?
Yeah, not to mention that there's a really unequal burden on who these technologies are deployed on, as well as the error rates and biases in different communities. So face recognition is a great example, where it's a tool that we use in Congress. It's not a tool that people in well-heeled communities have to face. The costs get spread largely in communities of color, not to mention that when these systems are inaccurate, they're often inaccurate in ways that exacerbate that harm in minority communities.
And as a follow-up question, I don't know that you necessarily have an answer, but I would be curious to hear about your thinking. I've been thinking myself in relation to, for instance, self-driving cars. So say AI systems maybe would reduce some of the racial disparities, but as David pointed out, they will still be making mistakes. And when a mistake is made, who's going to be at fault? Who is to blame? In the case of, say, currently, we all know, right? So there is, police department, there is someone who's to blame for a certain mistake being made. If it's an AI system at play, what's going to happen then? And I know this is a big question out there, but I would be just curious to hear about your thoughts.
I mean, Dave's the philosopher.
I think that's a very deep question, in the sense that it gets at who, when we deploy these things, is it the police department? Is it the policymakers? Is it the manufacturers? Is it the engineers who build some of these systems? I think the blame should rest on all of them, in the sense that each one is a check against deploying something that really can harm communities. Ultimately, the legal responsibility, I'm not sure if the courts have decided where that should rest. I've seen this playing out mostly in the bail decision. There's been AI systems deployed for trying to nominally create objective measures of whether to issue bail to some defendants. And when those do become biased, I think there's been some lawsuits that are working their way through the courts of, can you sue the manufacturer of that, or should you have to sue the local jurisdiction? Honestly, I don't know, but I do think that it does bring an interesting point, especially from the engineers, from folks who have to get the engineering society. We have professional societies that uphold standards, and when we produce students who go off to make these technologies, what are we doing to train them that they have those safeguards in mind when building these systems? So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I think it really gets at all the people touching this.
As I said, I wouldn't necessarily expect a complete full answer. I know it's still open. Nick?
Yeah, just one thing I want to highlight in Dave's answer is that this is one point of friction that we can that can be applied to people who are using these technologies. And so, I think it's important that they bear at least some responsibility for its consequences. But yeah, it's I also think it's important from this discussion that these are questions that the AI can't answer for us. It's questions where we need to decide as citizens and as community members what we expect from our institutions and the tools that they use. But yeah, that's an excellent question.
All right, so I think I'm about to get to my final question, but I want to encourage people to ask their questions in the Q&A. I see there is one question there already, and we'll get to that. And the final question that I wanted to ask is about any ethical concerns associated with the development and deployment of such AI tools, and whether we can counteract them. And you already highlighted some. Of course, racial disparity in itself is an ethical concern, but are there other aspects that one should be aware of when deploying tools?
Yeah, so I think one theme that's kind of come up again and again in this conversation is just how disproportionately low the costs are to employing AI can be to institutions, to law enforcement. and how disproportionately high the costs can be to communities, and particularly communities of color. And so one of the things that I try to think about in my work are how can we use AI to ensure good policing and ensure accountability. And so I think it's important that we try to brainstorm like what some of those tools can be. So for example, like, can we use AI to flag interactions that are going wrong, that are going to engender mistrust, and can we use that to hold law enforcement to the standards that that we expect from them? So I try to think a lot about how to at least have some parity or some balance between those different groups in our thinking.
I think with respect to the ethics of deployment and development, I guess to me, and I don't mean this to be like a cop-out, but I do think that each step along the way has serious ethical issues that have to be addressed in terms of where we get data to train the model. Is that data representative of the population? Is the resulting system creating imbalances in the ultimate judgments? Also, where is the data deployed? So Nick had mentioned that for some of these, they're deployed primarily, like disproportionately in communities of color. Who might bear the cost for this? I think there's issues in terms of how, as this becomes a commercialized area, the actual ethical cost of building these, knowing that the police departments that purchase them are buying them potentially at the cost of reducing police force or police headcount, thinking that AI may be able to do that trade-off, and are we actually making our communities better as a result? I don't think that we have a strong, the fairness and accountability and transparency part of the CS community has really done a good work in the past few years, really trying to get at how do we measure bias in these systems themselves and their decisions. But I don't think that is a holistic picture of how we actually might deploy or develop these systems. And I think that's something that has to get developed in the next few years as they come on the market.
And not to add to the challenge, there is also the issue of what are ethical considerations. Like different groups of people have different ethical views, and so applying one's view may conflict with another. Maybe say if we consider Ann Arbor, there might be, or even here, I mean, there are so many different cultures that are represented, let alone if we look at larger scale. So I can see a lot of challenges there as well. So let me move on to questions from the audience. Again, I will encourage you to please type your questions in the Q&A. So there is one question summarizing one of the AI technologies, which is Bayesian inference, basically considering the probability of, for instance, criminality as the product of some prior probability, which could be, say, race, and then the likelihood of an event to happen. So whatever evidence there is. And so the question states that the bias that was mentioned in this conversation likely appears in that prior probability. So if we were to remove bias, could we just consider some general prior, not a prior that, say, reflects race? Or I could also rephrase it more generally. Now, what are some ways to remove the bias that both of you have mentioned that can appear in these technologies?
Yeah, so one of the challenges that as I see it in relation to this question is that that these decisions aren't being made in a vacuum, and the things that would go into is this a high crime neighborhood, or does this person have a record, and things like this, which would inform your priors, are themselves the products of the same process that you're trying to regulate. So I'm wary of that approach, especially since the dominant model of policing for the last 20 or 30 years has been make as many contacts as possible in order to try to find the small number of people that are actually breaking the law at any given time. So, perhaps you could think about that in terms, there's a distinction between profiling in terms of like, do people look suspicious, which we know is used in a racially biased manner, and criminal profiling, which is when you have specific actionable intelligence. So maybe we could think about that in terms of the prior, but it's, for me at least, I think it's tricky with how many things get rolled into that estimation, even if you don't explicitly include race.
I would echo all the points that Nick just made, and emphasize that even seemingly objective measures may still be correlated with race. I think that is one of the big challenges for making sure that what you're asking isn't somehow a natural correlate. You're like, well, it's not the prior isn't focused on race, but it's actually focused on something that's strongly correlated.
There is another question related to this from the YouTube channel on how do the panelists think about the large pre-trained language models in terms of biases and discrimination, and are there technologies to mitigate those biases? So specifically focusing on language and how language would be used for legal informants or in legal informant settings. How can one go about mitigating the bias that appears in those large language models? Sure.
So I guess for folks who haven't heard about a large language model, maybe a good surrogate proxy for it is if you ever typed in your phone and it suggests the next word, or you did a Google search autocomplete where it suggests the rest of the query. Language models are kind of technology for like filling in the rest of that blank. And so some of these language models have, unfortunately, if you type like a Black person is known to, and you fill in that blank, you have, well, unfortunate results for some of the large pre-trained language models that do more than just autocorrect. They often back some of the key technologies that we use in our everyday lives, like any of the translation services or any of the speech understanding tools that maybe work in your home voice assistants. I'll say in terms of bias for these, that is a very active area. And there's been a few papers coming out of both research labs and industrial labs that really tried to pinpoint, how do we find this? I mean, the number of things that you could autocomplete in any space is huge. And so it's like, how do we know that we've actually fixed this problem? And we're not sort of, maybe we get the easy cases, but there's all sorts of bias that's sort of packed into these things that are just lurking to happen when we ask, our home voice assistant a question and it gives us something accidentally racist. I don't think there's been one solution yet, but there's been a number of very recent papers that are trying to combat this. So I'm not sure if that's answered the question, but it's definitely something that is on the mind of many folks working on these technologies.
And continuing on this line of questions around the ethics of these systems, and there is again a question from YouTube addressing fairness and pointing out that different people have different views of what's fair. Would it be possible for AI to go even farther than us human beings? And I guess we can interpret it either way, what farther means, like farther worse or farther better. But if any of you can pick that.
Yeah, so I see this is also similar to the next question about like what exactly justice means. And I think what is fair, what is just, these are eternal questions with or without AI. Just one thing that I find very interesting once algorithms enter the picture is that for many people, their conception of bias is one of personal preference. And so algorithms don't have personal preferences because they're not human beings. But clearly we've seen evidence that algorithms can be biased in both the way in which they make decisions and their outcomes. So that isn't an answer saying that there's one definition of fairness or justice, but I think that's those are things that we need to consider before AI enters the picture, and then think about how algorithms and artificial intelligence fit into that larger picture.
And so with that, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, there was also, which I think you also answered, Nick, and maybe it would be great to hear your view as well. So there was the other question, which was also asking about what exactly justice means. So fairness and justice, and how is AI really contributing to that, or could potentially contribute to that by deploying it?
Yeah, I think this is, these are eternal questions. My philosophy training is not prepare me for deploying them. I will maybe just to quickly touch on that ethics question. I want to echo Nick's points and just emphasize that I don't think AI is really the space to be looking at that as a final arbiter of what we've decided is an ethical outcome. I think it can be informed and it could be a potential smaller voice, but I think the people who are experiencing this often should have the final say. But I do think that gets to what the notion of justice is. And there's a long line of literature on procedural justice. Nick is definitely more of an expert than me, but I think two of the things that stand out for me are, one is thinking about transparency in the decisions. And so if we can explain why each of the decisions was made, both from the AI perspective and from an officer perspective, I think that can lead to a perception of this is a just encounter, even if I disagree with the outcome. Like I was speeding and I got pulled over, but I understand why that happened. And I think also thinking about the legitimacy and whether people who participate in the system view it as a legitimate encounter, even if it is transparent, you might still view it as illegitimate. And so I think making sure that the AI systems that we deploy are viewed by the community as a legitimate solution to, or not a solution, I hesitate to ever use the word solution, but as a legitimate tool to be used by the community. And that's again why we need the community's participation in the deployment of these, so that there isn't some sort of pushback or a surprise that what is this being done to me and my community? Why is this here?
And I'll jump over one question just because it's in the same space of ethics and what's fair and what's not. There's another question from YouTube on what is the kind of bias that we see in facial recognition? And you mentioned facial recognition as being used as one of the tools in legal enforcement, specifically thinking about, for instance, Black and brown people, the kind of bias we've been hearing about that exists in these tools.
Yeah, so I think in many ways it's similar kind of case as David described for language. And so, one thing I just want to highlight about this question is from an engineering standpoint, the solution would be train facial recognition models on more like Black faces so they can better distinguish. But, I think the larger question is that really what we want as a goal? And maybe we ought to consider the use of facial recognition as a tool in law enforcement, and what are the circumstances which we want it used in the first place. So I think there's, like so many of the questions that we've discussed this evening, there's both a technical engineering side and there's also a larger social side too. And I think facial recognition is an excellent example of that.
Maybe just to briefly chime in on the engineering side of that question. I mean, I fully agree with Nick. I think one of the ways that technology has tried to account for that. Joy Boulamami and Tanique Gebru have a great data set that is a metric called gender shades, which is a metric for measuring how good these facial recognition systems are, just for predicting gender. And one of the things that once you have a data set that you can evaluate on, you can actually test commercial systems to show whether they are or not performing in a disparate way for certain groups. So I do think that not only if we do decide that this technology is something that we want, there has to be other technologies that can actually be used to test it, to say whether it's actually being applied in a fair and uniform way across the community.
And there are, in fact, just noticing, not necessarily, I'm not working in computer vision or this space, but as a citizen, I've noticed that there are entire cities that have banned the use of facial recognition. And so that my interpretation is that it's really in response to these biases that have been noticed over and over. There is another question. We talked a little bit about data, police data, challenges to working with data, how you access it, heterogeneity, and so forth. And the question is asking about why we are not owning the data. So if this is data that eventually, I mean, it's our tax dollars pay for these technologies, why don't we own the data? And I assume by technology is really meant like technology is being used or the police or police cameras and the various departments.
Yeah, so, you know, I will say this every time I have the opportunity. I think it's there's no good reason, and it's rather unfortunate that things like traffic stops or use of force or even department level crime statistics are not recorded and made public in a commensurate way across departments. There's no reason for that. I think where it starts to get a little tricky is like when you think about things like body cameras, who can view them under what circumstances. I think it's a really interesting question. Like, I don't think that you would want those recordings made public, but some of the ways in which they're used now sometimes bias law enforcement. So, for example, some jurisdictions, police officers can view body camera footage before they make a statement, which gives them kind of an advantage in legal proceedings. So, you know, I think that's maybe a little afield of the AI question, but I think it's important to think about the different types of data and how widely it should be shared. But I think as a general practice, having it only within law enforcement and not even accessible to, you know, community police review boards and whatnot, like that's a problem.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think we touched on this earlier briefly, but one of the challenges of working with this data is sort of the respect for persons. And I agree that we need sort of federal standards because of the individual variance or the variance in individual jurisdictions. Some police departments are much more accessible. I believe like South Carolina, you can download some of these stop statistics freely, just as a regular citizen, but you can't necessarily in Michigan, or depending on which county you're in. And I think that that's something we could ask our local and state or even national legislatures to try to look at in terms of owning that.
I would just add to that there are complications that come from who is in those recordings. Like, say, even talking about a simple traffic stop recording and say I pass by, do I want the world to know that I've been there at, I don't know, 7:30 p.m.? Is that something that's supposed to be public or not? So it's also about the people who may appear just incidentally in those recordings, and how do we deal with that? So there might be complications, even if we say we own the data, who should have access to the data? I believe it's a second question. There is also another question again around bias, and I think a clarification would be right here. So the question is stating whether it's really the AI that's biased, or are we learning these biases from the amount of web data that we train these systems? Essentially, is this really our human bias at fault, or is it the AI system bias?
I'll say often this is due to the data, maybe not the AI algorithm itself, in the sense that if you train web data and you say, we're going to train on all the web just so we can learn better language, maybe some parts of the web are not as savory as others. And as a result, we end up inheriting some of the worst, like our worst norms and behaviors in these, whether that's an AI, the algorithm itself's problem. I think one of the challenges, especially for these newer AI technologies, is that they come, one of the great advances, you're standing on the shoulder of pre-trained models, which inherit all these latent biases to go off and do many different things. And so trying to separate out the AI from the data is actually very challenging in this sense. And I don't think we can do it. I think what it boils down to is making sure that as an AI practitioner, if you're going to build these models, that when you do it from scratch, you think very deeply about what you're training it on and what you're exposing it to, and whether you're perpetuating some harms or some sort of biases that you shouldn't be in practice that would have very unfortunate downstream effects.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think of it so much as a question of about blame, but it is a question like these systems aren't sold in by saying like, guess what, this will be just as biased as people, but it could just do it faster. Like that's not the way in which this technology is framed and discussed often. It's usually framed as an alternative to our human foibles. So just to echo Dave's point, where a lot of times it picks up on a lot of the same biases, or in some cases even capitalizes on the most unsavory human behaviors.
And I would just add, you mentioned David, Timnit Gebru's name. She, along with others, have been, of course, working on bias, specifically on bias that exists in facial recognition, for instance. And they've been showing, and I tend to agree, that bias comes a lot from data, but also from algorithms. So it's really the fault, if we were to call it that way. It's on both sides. And one very simple, I wouldn't necessarily call an algorithm, but say if we take the median versus the mean from a data distribution, the data is the same, but then the outcome may be very different. And so if you have even more sophisticated algorithms, so there can be bias also on the algorithm side, but it's also, as the person who was asking the question was pointing out, is really like, to some extent, is also our societal bias fault that with these algorithms we are just replicating, which is something really to, as you both pointed out, we have to take into consideration. So we have time for one more question, one or two more questions. We have several left. One question is asking about whether there is consideration of using AI in courts, and could AI be used on that, specifically talking about systems where they are based on precedents. Do you know of any such considerations of using AI in courts?
I would say most of the AI that I've seen in the court system has been used for bail or bond decisions. Is trying to supplement that in a neutral and at least nominally objective way. There are commercial systems that are deployed, and I think ProPublica had a really great long form piece on this if you're interested. I haven't seen it in the court system nominally yet. Sure.
I agree that I know there's some like academic research that tries to use natural language processing to understand like jurisprudence, but most of what I'm familiar with is the same research that David just discussed around bail decisions and algorithms used for like sentencing and decision making, and not necessarily from legal arguments.
All right, and we are on time. We can take one more question. Again, from YouTube, there is one of the criticism of AI is that it automates unjust systems at the expense of reimagining what it could be. So the question is, what kind of role can AI researchers play in this conversation of imagining what AI could do for legal enforcement, for instance, in the context of our conversation today?
So, I think that's an excellent point, and I don't think it's unique to AI research. I think it's common for a lot of people working on policy or in research generally, about how sometimes you can get so locked into how to tweak existing systems you don't think about alternatives. I will say that there's excellent work being done in social work and other domains about how to get resources to the people that need them the most. And so, for example, Desmond Upton Patton at Columbia, his lab does research looking at online Facebook discussions, and when like mediators might be deployed to help diffuse like a tense situation. Other researchers are using like hotspots policing to figure out like where you can rehabilitate abandoned buildings, and that actually has a causal effect on reducing crime. So I think that AI in the domain of crime and public safety and law, that can be generative and not just working on tweaking existing algorithms or just thinking in one way.
I do also want to add, even from like a small scale, so the paper that Nick and I worked on looking at the language of police officers, one of the benefits of AI is that when it is explainable, so there's a broad branch of AI called explainable AI, it can tell you a little bit about what is going wrong, so that, say, officers who want to do better have now actionable insights. And I believe that Jennifer Aberhart spearheaded some of this on actually like putting the insights from the AI systems output of like, this language needs to change, into the training procedures to see whether we can actually like change the system as a result. So it's really an opportunity for folks who are like, this is how I've always done it, how could I do it better? To provide really concrete steps of say this or interact this way, or here's where we're lacking as a department. So I think there's lots of opportunities there for thinking of AI as a partner and trying to find the gaps and ideally explain how to close that gap to make it a fair and just system.
I promise that was the last question, but there is one that's too related not to address, and I think also raising important points. As we think about reimagining the use of AI in this context, how should we be thinking about, say, minority communities? And this, well, I don't know if it's a discrepancy, but on one hand, minority communities would want to not be profiled, knowing that there are these downsides in AI. On the other hand, of course, they want to be protected from criminals, so they would want to have some kind of whatever advantages come with the use of such technologies. So how should we be considering these different concerns, possibly coming from the same community, say a minority community, as we think about future technologies?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, every community deserves to be safe and feel secure. When there's a shooting in a neighborhood, school attendance drops, health declines in the surrounding blocks. When there's a police shooting in a neighborhood, in minority neighborhoods, you see the same effects. So I don't think the discussion should only be between enforcement and safety as being two alternatives. I think the discussion should be what is the best way to promote safety with the smallest footprint and the most just interactions between citizens and law enforcement. And so some of the other uses I described are other ways to use AI for public safety, along with what David mentioned, trying to change the interactions that people do have with law enforcement. So I don't see those two as being opposed, and we can see many cases where communities are over policed, but also at the same time underprotected, or cases where, for example, homicides aren't cleared at the same rate in minority communities as they are in predominantly white ones.
I guess I'll also add, sort of harking or touching back on this earlier point about thinking about transparency and fairness. I think when these technologies do get deployed, I think it's important that we, as AI tech practitioners and community members, talk in a very accessible language about what's the risk and benefit of this technology. That it's not just, we're going to give this to you and not talk about the downsides or the risk or the benefits. So I think that speaks to, if they want to trust in policing, sometimes you have to trust in the tools, or at least understand when that trust comes with potential downside that may affect your community. I think part of the thing that may help that trust is to have more folks from underserved communities be in the AI field to begin with, and to better understand like how to develop technology that actually meets their specific needs. So rather than thinking about solutionism, thinking about it as something that comes as a community-driven grassroots solution.
I think this is a great ending point. It really needs to be a active conversation between police departments, in this case, communities, researchers, governments, policymakers, and so forth, involving everyone who could be affected or should have a say, and of course, everyday, like all the citizens. And that's part of our goal with this Friday Night AI, is to keep an active conversation between researchers and the community. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you, Nick, and thanks, David, for sharing all these insights tonight. And thank you very much to Tyler from the Ann Arbor District Library, to Aura from Michigan AI, and to the audience for all these wonderful questions, very thought-provoking. And we'll have our next Friday Night AI on November 12th. The topic will be AI, drones, and autonomous flights. So we look forward to seeing you there. We still don't know whether it's going to be virtual or in person at the library downtown, but we'll keep you posted. And thanks, everyone, and enjoy your evening and the weekend.